Rule 7 says, "Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient." He starts off this chapter by pointing out a harsh truth about human existence. That truth is, life is suffering. This harsh reality can be clearly seen in the biblical story of Adam and Eve. As God kicks them out of paradise for eating the forbidden fruit, he tells them of the suffering that is to come. Unto the woman he said, "I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." And to Adam he said, "Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground. Since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you will return." So how are we as people best able to deal with this suffering? One path many people take is they conclude that life is meaningless and they find meaning in the pursuit of pleasure. They pursue this pleasure by any means possible. They may lie, cheat, steal, deceive, and manipulate to achieve this pleasure. For if life is meaningless, then what's the difference anyhow? Every man for himself, and the devil take the hindmost. Pleasure may be fleeting, but it's better than the terror and pain of existence. Is there a better alternative? He proposes that something better might be obtained in the future by giving up something of value in the present. Ancient man only partially understood this, as they became dimly aware that reality was structured as if it could be bargained with. This can be seen in the rituals of animal sacrifice in many ancient cultures and all throughout the biblical writings. In ancient times, they sacrificed their animals, which were of great value to them, as a way of bargaining with God in hopes that he would answer their prayers. Today, this idea of sacrifice is symbolic and usually comes in the form of delayed gratification. In both the case of ancient and modern man, we are sacrificing something of value now to gain something later. This concept is what has allowed humans to build up a society. We all adhere to the social contract in one way or the other. This process requires us to sacrifice some of our unlawful impulses so that we may live in a relatively conflict-free world. So first and foremost, what must be sacrificed? Well, that depends on what you are trying to achieve. The larger the gain, the larger the sacrifice must be to achieve it. Here he uses the example of becoming a doctor. The ability to save lives, the social recognition, and the large salary make it quite a large gain, and thus it requires a large sacrifice to attain. After all, med school costs a lot of time and money, and overworked med students rarely have the free time to pursue their pleasures. Secondly, we must ask, what is the best possible sacrifice we could make to bring about the best possible gain? Here he talks about value and how values are unique to each individual. What one person values might be meaningless to another. Therefore, what might be a great sacrifice for one person could be a very small sacrifice for another. Sometimes we must sacrifice what we value most to bring about the change that we desire. To explain this further, he analyzes the biblical story of Abraham. Abraham was unable to have children for most of his life. God finally gifts him with the son, Isaac, But then later, God demands that he sacrifice to him what he values most, his son Isaac. Abraham obeys God's command, and right as he is about to sacrifice his son, an angel swoops in to save the day and replaces Isaac with a ram. Now, to fully understand the meaning behind this story, he explains the self-evident fact that sometimes in life, things don't go well. However, sometimes when things don't go well, it's not the cruel world that's at fault, but rather our own refusal to let go of something that we value. To explain this concept, he uses an analogy of an old story on how to catch a monkey. In this story, the hunter gets a large, narrow-necked jar and fills it with rocks so it is too heavy for the monkey to carry away. Then he adds some treats on top of the rocks to entice the monkey. The monkey comes along and, seeing the treats, slips his hand through the narrow opening to grab a treat. Once the monkey has the treat firmly grasped in his hand, it will not be able to remove its clenched fist out of the narrow opening. The monkey, refusing to let go, will be trapped, and the hunter can easily walk up and grab the monkey. The animal will not sacrifice the part for the whole. Viewed this way, we can start to see that sometimes our misfortune comes about as a result of clinging to something that we value and from our refusal to let it go. Now, life is hard enough to begin with, but it can be made even harder by the evil that comes about as a result of bitterness and resentment. If we don't confront this bitterness, then our sacrifices are made begrudgingly and become less effective. This can be seen in the story of Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel both work hard and make sacrifices to God, but the major difference between the two is the attitude in which they make the sacrifices. Abel does it willingly and is rewarded in turn. Cain does so begrudgingly and becomes bitter and envious of Abel's bigger and better reward. This bitterness grows until Cain is consumed by evil and murders his brother out of jealousy and to spite the Creator. As a consequence, he is cursed and the suffering is more than he can bear. When one is the victim of this type of evil, it can make the impulse to forsake meaning and sacrifice and instead pursue instant gratification even stronger. To draw a comparison and show a different path, he tells the story of Christ's temptation by the devil shortly before he is crucified. Christ, who had been fasting, is first tempted with food. He is then tempted to throw himself off a cliff and invoke God to save him. And finally, he is offered to rule over all the kingdoms of man. He refuses all offers, for he knows that the expedient gains that the temptations offer mean nothing if they cause him to betray his soul. The lesson here should be that sometimes, in order to bring about the change we desire, we must sometimes sacrifice tempting shortcuts and opportunities if they require us to add to the evil in the world. With the rise of Christianity in the world, a lot of problems that plagued ancient man were solved. Christian belief put all people on the same playing field, whether a king or a slave. All were equal in the eyes of God. Slowly but surely, mankind left behind many of its barbaric practices. No longer were people brutally tortured and murdered as a form of entertainment for the masses. However, as mankind left these problems behind and our standards rose, we lost sight of the progress we had made. Carl Jung believed that man was driven to science to answer the questions that remained unanswered by Christianity. Spiritual salvation is great, but why must we suffer in the meantime, here and now on earth? These unanswered questions has led to a rise in atheism in more recent years. This questioning can be seen in Friedrich Nietzsche's famous quote, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, murderers of all murderers, console ourselves? That which was the holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us?" If God really is dead in the minds of Western man, then what will rise up to replace the God idea? Carl Jung discovered that we cannot invent our own values because we cannot merely impose what we believe on our souls. This can be seen when we attempt to do things like stop procrastinating, eat healthier, drink less alcohol, and try as we might, we fall short time and time again. Instead of creating our own moral compass, much of society has fallen into nihilism, as well as an equally dangerous susceptibility to new, totalizing utopian ideas, as can be seen in the rise of communism and fascism in the 20th century. That in part led to the horrors of World War II. How can this evil be confronted? Here he reveals the true meaning of taking on the sins of the world such as Christ did. We must recognize our own capacity for evil, our own capacity to be the Nazi prison guard or the torturer of children in a medieval dungeon. Only when we recognize this evil within us can we find the good that opposes it. So aim high, pay attention, fix what you can fix. Don't be arrogant in your knowledge. Strive for humility. Recognize your own capacity for evil and tendency to add to the suffering of the world. And above all, don't lie. Instead, strive to lessen pain and suffering, not only your own, but the suffering of others as well. Expedience is following blind impulse. It's lying and manipulating for the sake of short-term gain. Meaning emerges when impulses are regulated. We begin to find meaning when we value the betterment of life for not only us, but all life. This meaning is life-sustaining. It allows us to focus on what really matters, rather than be led astray by the suffering inherent in life. When we stop focusing on pointing everything out that's wrong with the world, we might start to notice little things we could fix to make life slightly better. When we start to pursue meaning, we begin to feel as if we are in the right place at the right time. The world is a forum of sharing and trading, not a treasure house for plundering. To give is to do what you can to make things better. This good, in turn, is paid forward, and it ripples out and multiplies. As we find deeper meaning, life becomes better and better, and ever more beautiful. And perhaps we will realize life isn't made of matter, but rather of what matters. So, pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient.